In fact, that's why she wanted me to connect with you. And to talk to you further. So I was very keen to, You know, last DT meetup, you were here, I remember, and I think I missed meeting you. Like,
before it gets too busy.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
For Kevin and Vera. At the top.
So welcome to Sydney Design Thinking number 99. So this is our 99th. We're almost at 100, that'll be next month. But tonight we're really lucky to be hearing from Martin and Steve, and we'll get to them in a moment. But to kick off, just want to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal country and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And it's also National Reconciliation Week, so check it out, get involved, see how you can be part of it, but also it's not just a week, it's a way of life and being. And hopefully we all agree with that. A huge thanks to our sponsors. So Think Place, where's Michelle hiding now?
I'm blending with you.
Yeah, camouflage. Thanks Michelle and Think Place. You want to do a shout out? What is Think Place? What do you do?
We are a strategic design consultancy, so we work with government, not-for-profits, and socially responsible businesses. So we're grounded in design thinking and sort of like the core of how we approach problems. But shameless plug, I am also hiring for my team at the moment, so I am looking for a new team role, open to meeting anyone. Please reach out.
Awesome, and thanks again to Think Place. And I'm Ben. I don't normally say that part, so I'm Ben. I'm from Dynamic 4. We're a social enterprise and B Corp, and everything we do is about how do we use leadership, design and innovation to help create the conditions for happier communities and living on a cleaner planet. We do that by coaching, training and working alongside leaders to help them solve problems that matter. So, our SydDTs are brought to you every month by, everyone's at the back tonight, Zoe's closest. Thanks, Zoe. Kate, Lucas, where'd Kylie go? And Kylie and Nicole. Everyone is really at the back. So we're a group of volunteers that have been bringing this to you for the last almost 9 years. And so next month is our 9th birthday and 100th meetup. Which leads us to a massive thanks to all of you as our members. So an awesome community that's grown a lot over the almost 9 years. As at this morning, we're at 9,377 members. So we're on that last little climb to 10,000 members. We're almost there.
you got a month to do it.
You've got a month to do it. And so you need to bring your friends to sign up for SydDT. And as a little bit of incentive, not to talk about another book, but I've got a copy of my book as a door prize, as a prize next month for anyone that joins between, I started that I think a month ago, so it's about a 2-month period. So for everyone who signs up, they don't need to be on the room on the night, but if you sign up, even if we don't get the 10K, still do a randomizer to win a copy of my book. I don't know if that's an incentive, it might not be. And so if you hit that QR code, that'll get you to the meetup page for next month. We're about halfway through ticket sales, so if you haven't already got your ticket, get onto it. The topic is going to be delivering inclusive experiences in public services. As I mentioned, it's our 100th, it's our 9th birthday, and there'll be cupcakes. So there's a chance of my book and cupcakes. And 100 cupcakes.
Yay!
So hit that QR code and look forward to seeing you then. The other thing coming up is in June is Design Outlook in Melbourne. It's going to be the last one, unfortunately. If you hit that QR code, and they'll get you to the ticket page, but use the code SydDT. Ben's Friends also works as a promo code, and I'll get you a $100 discount off the general admission ticket. So I think that makes the ticket $650, which is for the week. So it's a main conference day on the Thursday, workshops on the Friday, and there's sort of meetups and open houses and stuff Monday to Wednesday. So another little taster. So that's all the stuff to come. But the stuff we're going to do right now is stoked to be able to introduce Steve and Martin. I'll let them do their bios because it's they would take the rest of the hour or so. Both been doing awesome things. I'm stoked to call you both friends and collaborators for a long, long time. And Martin actually did one of his many book launches at SydDT in 2018, February. Meetup number 25, to be specific. Design, Think, Make, Break, Repeat. So it's still an awesome book, very relevant. Got a refresh as well, didn't it, last year?
Second edition, 2 years ago,
And so check that out as well. And it's also supported by a website which has got a whole bunch of free tools and resources, which down at that practitioner level, loads of awesome stuff there. So stoked to welcome you back, and I think it's your first SydDT maybe?
No.
Outside of Mega Meetups.
I was at the first one.
Were you?
Yes.
Wee. 1 to 99. Excellent.
I think I was at 1 through sort of 6 or 7.
When it was back in the iCentral days.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
There you go.
I do not expect you to remember that date. That is a long time.
So I've only missed 5 of 100. So, so on that, I'm going to get out of the way, and let's welcome Steve and Martin.
Drop that.
Thank you.
Over to you,
I
Mike.
kick off.
Yeah.
Actually, I don't normally do this, but I actually wrote a few notes because it really wanted to make sure I don't forget anything. First of all, it's amazing to be standing here, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming tonight. And it's something I've been really looking forward to this event, especially. And thank you to Ben, Zoe, Kate, Lucas, and Carly for organizing this and for inviting us. We really appreciate the invitation. Also, big thank you to ThinkPlace. I've heard so many great things about ThinkPlace. Haven't managed to come actually to their space, so it's really exciting to be here for this event tonight. Also wanted to, well, first of all, maybe acknowledge the amazing knowledge in this room. I had quite a few conversations before we kicked off with people in this room and their backgrounds and the work they're doing, and it's all, A, it's amazing, and B, it's really important work. And I think there's so many experts in this room, and it's so great to meet everyone. And I don't know, I feel really honored to have the opportunity to stand here and talk to everyone, but also to have had the chance to talk to people beforehand and after the event. And I also invite everyone to make sure to take the opportunity and chat to each other and make new connections with each other. Also wanted to say that, of course, while Steve and my name's on the front of the book, there's a big team of very talented people behind the project that helped us make this project reality. From the point of where I think the idea was born to submitting it to the publisher was about 1.5 years. Is that what worked out? Close to 2 years. Close to 2 years. Until they had the first copy in our hands was probably over 2 years. Of course, there are many years of research from my side and practice from Steve's side before we started writing and sort of which went into the book and was the foundation for the book. But we also were really fortunate to be working with the amazing shapeshifters. So Ellen and Diana, who are also here, thank you for coming again tonight. And so Ellen and Diana did a beautiful design from the cover to all the diagrams and graphics and illustrations throughout the book. And no, they didn't just do the layout or graphic design. We actually went through a co-design process with shapeshifters together. So we had many sessions where we talked about the content, the ideas we wanted to communicate, and what the best way was to tell that story through visuals. And often that actually changed the way we thought about the story ourselves. And Ellen and Diana were really good about asking the right questions. So we're like, oh, actually that's a good question. Maybe we need to think a bit more about that. We also were fortunate to work with 2 amazing editors, not just one, but 2 amazing editors. In the center here, on the left, we have Jacqueline Hall, and on the right, we have Verity Borthwick. So it was just a really amazing experience to be working with them, and they also were able to bring their background to the project as well. So Jacqueline is actually trained in journalism, now working in a business school, and Verity actually has a PhD in geosciences and is now an editor. And so it was really, really helped. I'm going to read a section today about diversity, and I think for us having this diversity in the team was really, really an important contributing factor. And not pictured here is Adrian, a former student of mine, now a PhD student and colleague at the University of Sydney in the design lab. Adrian Wong helped us with the referencing and the footnotes, and the many in the book, so it's a lot of work for Adrian. With that, I think we are ready to do a bit of a reading, Steve.
Yeah.
And do you want to kick us off?
I will, thank you. I will express my thanks as well for you all for being here. It's a humbling experience to stand here and have you all listen to words that we have written. So, without you reading anything into what I'm about to read, this section is titled Infinite Regret. So, even if initiatives have the well-intended goal to make things better for consumers, they can lead to unintended consequences with devastating effects on societies and ecosystems. Before I continue, there are two sort of sayings that I want to just sort of throw out there. One is that no good turn goes unpunished. If you've ever come across that one, that's what this section's about. The other one is from a book that was written many years ago by a guy called Terry Goodkind, who wrote a series of books called Wizard's First Rule. And the Wizard's first rule is that people are stupid, but the second rule is that great harm always comes from good intentions. And that's really at the heart of this section. So it's one of the sort of the key learnings of the book is this idea that we really need to think more broadly about the design decisions that we're making. And in order to at least mitigate those sorts of bad outcomes, we need to think about them first. So, in 2006, designer and entrepreneur Asa Raskin wanted to improve the browsing experience on websites. Raskin came up with the concept of infinite scroll to replace the chunky, clunky experience of the next page button. By creating a mechanism that allowed website content to incrementally load as the user scrolls, he believed people would be able to focus their attention and better control the speed with which they navigated websites. Raskin was devastated when he discovered that the way social media companies implemented infinite scroll led to users becoming hooked to feeds for longer and reinforced addictive behaviour. In 2019, Raskin publicly expressed his regret that his invention helped facilitate addictive behaviour. Reflecting on the negative impact of infinite scroll, Raskin wrote on Twitter that optimising something for ease of use does not mean best for the user or humanity. It is impossible to retract an invention like infinite scroll once the unintended consequences become apparent. The positive consequences, in this case, keeping people on a website or app for longer and making more money through views and advertising, outweigh the negative consequences when considered through the neoliberal lens that drives organisations in today's markets. Beyond the social issue of reinforcing addictive behaviour and wasting time, infinite scroll also creates an environmental impact through encouraging media consumption. Social platforms like TikTok have optimised their algorithms to keep loading videos that capture users' attention, contributing to the million human lifetimes wasted and millions of tonnes a year of emissions propelled into the Earth's atmosphere. Recognising the impact of his invention, Raskin co-founded the Centre for Humane Technology to expose how harmful technologies affect the well-being of people and communities. He was joined on this mission by former Google design ethicist Tristan Harris. Harris was an early tech whistleblower with his scathing inner sanctum insights on the immorality of the rising tech sector, featuring in the groundbreaking documentary The Social Dilemma. In the documentary, Harris sets out how companies deliberately build addictive mechanisms into their websites and apps in order to maximise their profits. These practices, like designed obsolescence, lead to consequences that are by design rather than unintended. Using the methods and strategies introduced in this chapter, designers and decision makers can spotlight the far-reaching impacts of these kinds of design decisions, highlighting potential boomerang effects. That's a reference to something we've spoken about earlier, by the way, that will ultimately also damage the organisation's business operations. I'm going to stop there. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
And we'll go through a couple of slides in a moment as well. We'll where we'll talk a little bit more about the tactics and the tools and the strategies that are part of the tactics that Steve just mentioned. I'm going to read the beginning of chapter 6, and so each of the chapters, and that's probably a product of working with our editors, in particular Jacqueline. Each of the chapters starts with a little story, and the story then often sort of weaves its way throughout the chapter, and so we return throughout chapter to that story to illustrate the way we can use the tools and the strategies that we describe in the chapter. Each of the chapters also has a subtitle. And the subtitle is not always necessarily totally clear what it means. It's a little abstract, but it connects with something in the chapter and the story. So the chapter 6 that I'm going to read is called Capturing Diverse Perspectives. And it's one of the tactics, also the name of one of the tactics. And the subtitle is Biases and Bubbles. And we also have these beautiful flyers at the back where the pizza was just a moment ago. Thank you. Those are the flyers at the back. And so these are some of the beautiful illustrations from Shapeshifters that are sort of based on the subtitles of the chapters. And so we've got 9 postcards there at the back for the 9 different tactics, and there's also a little description of each of the tactic on the back. There's a bit of a teaser. This is the chapter really, this is our 3rd reading, and I've been really looking at this for all of the previous events and wanting to read this chapter, and it was always a close second, and tonight I'm really excited about reading this chapter. It also, well, you'll see, it also connects a little bit with where I'm now at UTS. We didn't do a bias, but yeah. They're in the book and on the back.
This is Martin. I'm Steve.
What maybe I should say before for context is that until about 14 months ago, I was in the design school at the University of Sydney, and I've recently moved across to the University of Technology Sydney, UTS, to lead the transdisciplinary school. So I've sort of done that shift from design or from a disciplinary group to the transdisciplinary school, and so I'm picking up on that. My reading is going to be picking up on that in that chapter. August de los Reyes has impacted the lives of millions of people. Holding design leadership roles at Microsoft, Pinterest, Google, and Bank, he made it his objective to advocate for inclusivity and diversity. He believed that design solutions should cater for as many people as possible, including those from marginalized communities, and serve multiple generations while minimizing the impact on the ecosystems that sustain life on our planet. For the last decade of his too short life, De Los Reyes came to appreciate what it was like to be part of a demographic too often forgotten when design decisions are made. At the age of 42, only 6 months after starting as head of design at Xbox, he fractured his spine. An initial misdiagnosis led to the complete loss of his ability to walk. Confined to a wheelchair, he quickly discovered the world was not a very inclusive place. Simple activities, like navigating his wheelchair down the footpath or going out for dinner with friends, involved obstacles because of decisions that didn't consider what the world looked like from his perspective. Driven by these experiences, De Los Reyes decided to use his insights to challenge the status quo. His mission became to improve the lives of others who, like himself, were pushed to the margins because of decisions made by designers and engineers. At Microsoft, he collaborated with others to pioneer inclusive design. During his time at Pinterest, he worked with teams to redesign the platform for vision-impaired people and implemented a new feature showing people of diverse skin tones when users searched for beauty tips and products. Diversity for De Los Reyes was about a spectrum of thoughts, experiences, and approaches. By drawing on different points of view, opportunities for innovation would open up and lead to better outcomes. Echoing this sentiment, the Transdisciplinary School, which I lead at the University of Technology Sydney, uses the slogan, "Great minds don't always think alike," to emphasize the value of diverse perspectives. Taking this approach requires us to also be prepared to think harder. It is more difficult to arrive at a consensus or a decision to agree to disagree when working with diverse perspectives. This is a good thing, as it prevents us from taking shortcuts and creating unintended consequences. The benefits of diversity. We can extrapolate the Los Reyes strategy of involving different viewpoints to create opportunities for responsible innovation and drive positive change in our organizations. Importantly, those viewpoints need to extend beyond the typical interactions across departments, such as design, engineering, and marketing. Devising new approaches requires truly transdisciplinary collaboration across and between the confines of traditional disciplines. Bringing together the practices and knowledge of different disciplines gives us a wider array of potential actions, which means we are more likely to identify an action that creates a better outcome. It's true, the more pronounced the frictions, the greater the effort to arrive at an outcome. It's also the case that spending more time on negotiating perspectives is more likely to lead you to new ways of thinking about a problem. Until we're confronted by it, it's very easy to believe that there's just one right and proper way to view and engage with the world and the people in it. Transdisciplinary perspectives are key to tackling the global scale challenges that communities and organizations are facing. Incorporating different viewpoints results in a wider range of possible actions. It also helps us to reduce biases that might otherwise limit our perspective and solution space. Thank you.
Before we go on, I just want to offer up two really quick stories to highlight why that is important. So we heard about Augustus, but who's aware of the idea of sort of crash testing cars, right? Like, we're all familiar with the idea that we crash test cars, right? We use crash test dummies. Now, crash test dummy is an average human. It is meant to replicate an average human and give you an idea of the damage that would occur to that person in the event of an accident were they sitting in that vehicle, right? All makes perfect sense, and there are standard safety ratings that come from those tests. Up until recently, there was no requirement for a crash test dummy to simulate a female body. None. And recently, it became, I think, law in the European Union that all cars had to be tested with a anatomically female crash test dummy. But all of the crash test dummies that they use that are female are just 70% the size of the male dummy. Now, for the women in the room, you will probably recognise that there's a flaw in that plan, because that's not the way you're built, and that's not the way like we are as humans. But even in the countries that have put into law that you must test a vehicle with a female crash test dummy, there's no rule that says that it needs to be behind the steering wheel. And that's today. That is today. So when we talk about this stuff, like, we have this argument of, do we really need to say this thing? Like, is it really necessary that we need to make like the diverse perspectives are actually a useful thing? And then we come across stories like that. There was another one. In February this year, I think it might have been Choice. So you're familiar with Choice? They do tests of various things. Choice magazine, for the very first time, tested a range of period products using blood. And it was the first time that they had ever been tested by anyone, including the manufacturers, using anything other than water and dye. I read that and I literally stopped in my tracks, stunned. I could believe that Choice had never done it, fair enough, but I couldn't believe that the people making these products had never done it themselves. Lo and behold, it turns out that they don't work in the same way depending on, if you're not using water to do the test, they don't perform the same. I was stunned, and then I sort of keep coming back to this kind of thing and go, well, maybe we do need to spell some of this stuff out. So I keep coming back to those two stories. Fiona and I were talking about the diversity of perspectives and why they're important in architecture just today. But I am stunned by the prevalence of design practices where it is normal that the people who are actually going to use the thing that's being designed have no input whatsoever into the design of that thing. It is stunning.
And this was a great demonstration why it was an amazing experience to work with Steve, because he pulls these stories out of his back pocket. Yes. Should we have a look at some slides?
Sure. Because we do have them, and you did.
We do have slides, as you should have in a good presentation. Right? So one of the reoccurring themes in the book is the discussion of the limits of good design and the limits in particular of human-centered design. And importantly, we're not saying we no longer need human-centered design, because there's still a really important place in the world for human-centered design. Maybe the crash test summit story is actually an example of that.
Yeah.
And you probably have seen, it looks a bit faded on the screen, but and in fact you might not even be able to see this. You might have seen this diagram popularized by Ayoub, which talks about innovation happening at the intersection of where the technology, the human values, and the business values come together. So that was kind of the foundation of human-centered innovation, or human-centered design as a framework. And so in the book we are using or arguing for a shift from human-centered to life-centered design. And life-centered design decenters the human. So it doesn't take the human out of the design process, but it says, well, the human is just one, the user or customer is just one element that we need to consider in a design process. There might be other humans, like the women drivers in the car example, or maybe representatives of other marginalized communities that we have not considered in the design process, or that don't have a voice in the design process. And so what we are suggesting in the book is, and this is sort of drawing also on some research, is that we need to add the responsibility perspective, which focuses on the environmental and ethical values. And we make a case in the book that designer is actually ideally positioned to be the custodians of the responsibility perspective. And it doesn't mean, that's quite important, doesn't mean we as designers have to become sustainability experts necessarily, or have to study the science behind sustainability, or learn everything about the environment in order to be able to represent it in the design process. But what we're really good at is we're able to bring people together and to capture ideas and insights and visualize those. And so we can speak to experts in these areas that represent, say, marginalized communities or ecosystems, or have a better understanding about complex processes, and then bring those together, bring people together, collect the data and visualize the data and feed it into the decision-making process. And we also in the book describe, definitely can't see this, you'll have to get the book to read those. We also talk about life-centered design principles, and they're actually based on some work from the Life-Centered Design Collective, which is a global network of life-centered designers that we co-founded a few years ago. I'll come back to those later, actually. You want to talk about the tactics?
Yeah, so we've broken the book up into 3 parts, and each of those parts has 3 parts to it. But what we're trying to do is allow people to shift their perspective in their design work, and provide the sort of the tools, the techniques, the mindsets that allow you to do that. So in the first collection, we've got this section around networks, which is around things like understanding the larger system, identifying unintended consequences, and capturing diverse perspectives. We've got the section around interventions, which is about visualising impact, envisioning futures and implementing change. And the third one around partnerships, which is becoming a strategic leader, getting buy-in and enabling effective collaboration. And collectively, we feel, and in our practice and our experience, we've seen that allows people to make better design decisions, to work more effectively with other members of the team, to engage more effectively with the organisation, to make better design decisions, and ultimately put better things out into the world. That's the idea. This is it in a little more detail. I won't worry about it.
It's one page in the book.
This is one page. But we sort of, like, within each of the chapters, we get into a number of different topics. So we get into a bit of detail so that you can be quite practical. And at the end of each chapter, we've got, I don't know whether this is the next slide, and I'm going to ruin it.
We don't have a slide, but it's a good point to talk about
just
it.
Around, at the end, we sort of talk about what is something small that you can do that might build over time. So we call them 1% changes, but what are these little things that you can do within your organisation that won't necessarily kick up a fuss, that won't create huge barriers, but if you start doing them, they will build over time. And one of the overarching themes of the book is that the problems that we're seeing have built slowly over time. They didn't start in 2000, they didn't start in 1990, they started in the 1780s or the 1820s or the 1870s or the 1950s, depending on which problem you really want to put a pin in. And they've built over time, and we've gotten to a point where a lot of them are hitting at the same time at really, really massive scale. And our solutions don't have to be massive change. What we need to also do is to start thinking about, well, let's make small positive changes that can also build over time. And maybe it will take 50 years for us to actually see, you know, like the scale of impact that we're seeing in terms of the scale of the problem, but we'll start to see improvement straight away is the idea. And those little changes we sort of go through at the end of each chapter in the book. Yeah. We try.
We wanted to maybe go through two of the tools as examples if we have time. Where's Ben? Do we have time for doing that? Okay.
Yeah.
So Steve and I each picked an example of a tool that we describe in one of the chapters. So this is from the chapter Envisioning Futures, and it's a tool that's based on a method called backcasting. And backcasting is essentially a futuring method, and that's also, futuring is an important theme in the book, and also an important, we believe, an important skill that we as designers and decision makers have to develop and practice. And so the way backcasting works is that you we identify, first of all, a future scenario on the far right. So it doesn't matter if you can't read the text. On the far right of this canvas, we have the future scenario. And we describe the future scenario in terms of the parameters. So the example here is about energy supply in cities. And so the future scenario might be, we have locally produced energy, we have a decentralized off-grid energy system, and we have neighborhood sharing, maybe, for example, involving batteries and sharing of electricity on a local scale. And then we go back to the present, to the current state, and we compare each of those parameters with the current, we map each of the parameters to the current state. And so, for example, at the moment, we have a centralized energy grid, and it's controlled by large corporations. And so we sort of mapped it out, and then we think about the transition steps. So what steps are needed in order for us to help shift communities, society, organizations, slowly to the future state, to the ideal future scenario. And then we can also think about the projects that we may need to do, which is bringing people together, teams together, diverse teams together to start working on these things. And this is quite it sounds maybe a little complicated, but it's quite easy to use in practice. And you can do it on a whiteboard, you can just do a piece of paper. It's quite easy to bring a group of people along on the journey. Now, you do need to know the future state, and in the book we also talk about other tools and strategies that help us identify that future state. One of the ways that we've done that in a project I worked on at the university was to use these, what we call actor cards and concept cards. And so if you can't read it from the back, we have, for example, an actor card for a year 12 student here, and also an IBIS, so we also have non-human actor cards. So this project...
Bin chicken gets a ticket.
Yeah. You don't call them bin chickens.
No!
So this was a project about the future of urban living, essentially. So hence why we looked at these different human and non-human personas that we find in cities, and then sort of mapping out the needs and how how they currently use the city. And the concept cards are based on maybe future concepts or research. So here we have co-living as a concept, and then we can use those in the participatory workshop, and that's what we did in that project, to identify the future scenario and then bring people along on the journey of mapping out what does it look like to move us a little bit closer to that scenario. And importantly, I haven't said it yet, this could be like next week or next year, or it could be in 20 years' time. So those allows us to work on different time scales. I think this is where I hand over to, one more slide here. At the end of the chapter Envisioning Futures, we draw on a beautiful piece written by Brian Eno, in which he talks about the long now. And so we map out what we need to do now as designers and decision makers to move us from the designing for the now to designing for the long now. So moving from things like short-term thinking to long-term thinking, which is also picked up in the later chapter, from business-driven to value-driven, from a shareholder focus to a future generations focus. That's also an important theme in the book. And from things like human-centered to life-centered innovation. Now I think I hand over to you to talk about systems.
Yes. No. I'm going to have to figure out the buttons.
It's arrow to the left goes to the left.
There you go. It is complicated. So
What is on?
I chose, no, it works perfectly well. It's my eyesight. So, the one that I chose was on system mapping. And the reason that I chose that, and given that you're a design thinking audience, you know the importance of reframing that design, like the power that reframing has to design as a process. At the end of our sense making, at the end of our synthesis process, we take this step where we try and look at the problem from different perspectives. And there are a number of different ways that we can go about it that help shift our thinking, and with that shift in thinking, the way in which we can see the solutions. So if we really want to arrive at different solutions, we really need to start thinking about the problem differently as well. So this idea of reframing is an important one. And one of the key techniques of reframing, one of the key ways that you can reframe a problem, is to expand your perspective. A good example of that from the 1950s was a trucking magnate who came up with the idea of the shipping container. So a guy by the name of Malcolm McLean was looking at his ships, was looking at his trucks sitting idling, waiting for the ships to be unloaded. And in response, he sort of realised that speeding up the stevedoring process was only going to get you so far. And he ended up coming up with the idea, initially they came up with the idea of putting the entire truck on the ship. And they iterated, because that's daft, and instead they came up with the idea of just putting the trailer on. And then subsequently iterated and came up with the idea of the shipping container. Now, as a result, shipping costs have dropped 90% since the 1950s. So he came up with that idea in 1956. So it's only 68 years, but 90% of the cost of moving a ton of goods around the world has disappeared as a direct result of that change. But he did it by looking beyond the immediate problem of getting stuff off a ship, and instead thinking about the supply chain and how to move things more effectively around it. So this idea for me around thinking in terms of systems is one where in our design work we're doing exactly that. So the first step for me is to say, well, where is this thing that I'm designing within the broader system? What does that system look like? How do those different components relate to one another? What is their relationship to each other? How does the dynamic work in terms of positively and negatively reinforcing behaviours that might impact the production of waste or the production of, like, the increase in sales or any of those sorts of things? but you map it out first. And this is just a series of relationships that show whether one thing has a positive or a negative impact on another. And you'll see chains of relationships, not just sort of direct relationships between one another. It also tells you, it gives you a sense of how long it takes for feedback to get back to the thing that you might be looking at. So if you make a change and it goes through a thing and goes through a thing and goes through a thing and comes back around and ultimately reinforces or changes where you were to begin with, that might take years as a feedback loop. So when you make a change to that thing, it might take years before you see an impact. So when we talk about designing for the long now, part of it is that the feedback on natural systems can take decades to come back to us. We can make small changes to something that might have a large impact, but it takes decades. So we have to actually identify that relationship first. And I think this is a key step to shift us away from thinking about the thing that we're designing to start thinking about the impact that those things have. So we talk about system mapping. This is a much more complicated map, but honestly, this is a much more likely outcome of any type of system mapping project. Systems are complicated. And the act of mapping a system also forces you to make choices around what you will take responsibility for and what you are going to declare as somebody else's problem. So you start to have to make active choices about waste, about pollution, about energy use, because you draw a little circle around your part of it and go, well, this is the bit that I care about, and the rest of it, someone else can clean up that mess. And a big step, we think, a big step is us as a community of practitioners around the world saying, actually, that's not going to work anymore. We at least need to work together with the people downstream and upstream to make better choices. That's the intent of that section. I think it's really important because it's, like, for me, it's one of the really critical changes in our perspective. And that shift in perspective is one of the key ways that we start making different decisions. This is another example. This one's in the book, and it talks about the way in which these things just interrelate between economic, between social, between environmental. You get a chance to have a look. I'm not going to keep telling you to take a look in the book, but you know, it's all in the book. All right. The store.
The store.
This is a new slide for me.
It's a
But
new
the,
slide.
the store for the store for the book is online.
So you can, of course, get we will have a few copies to give out after this talk, and Steve will explain after the Q&A how that will work.
Yes.
You can, of course, get a copy of the book online, and also in bookstores, local bookstores. So wherever you get your books normally from, you can get the book from there. What this is an online store that our friends from Shapeshifters have helped us create. And it's not a merchandise store. That's important. People go like, oh, you got a merch store. Yes, it looks maybe like that because there's bags and t-shirts and hoodies. The reason it's a bit of a conceptual store because we were like, we actually want to try to have an impact with the work we do. And so we had all these beautiful illustrations in the book and the graphics and the beautiful messages. And someone, I think, at some point said, oh, that would look good on a t-shirt. And so we're like, oh, maybe other people think that too. And so we're like looking at how can we do like print on demand, but in a sort of, maybe a print on demand it's somewhat sustainable. So we found Gelato, which is an online platform, and they have local printing hubs, production hubs, so it doesn't ship around the world. And they also use organic cotton in the t-shirts and recycled polyester in other products. And so we, Shapeshifters helped us set up this store where you can get things like the life-centered design principles that are even smaller here, but you can buy them in a poster that is A2 for you all. So you can always see them from across the room, from across the office space.
Where do the proceeds go, Martin?
And all the proceeds. Another reason why it's not a merch store is because 100% of the profit is donated to Common Ground, which is an indigenous organization dedicated to indigenous storytelling and sharing of knowledge. We hope people enjoy the products that are on that store. And I think that's it. I think
Q&A.
that's the Q&A time. If you have time for that, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. Definitely time for Q&A.
Okay.
You guys are highly skilled facilitators, so I'll let you handle it.
Can I start with a question?
Yeah, okay. At the front. Question up the front. Yeah.
So I've met a few current or former students in the audience tonight and also previous events, which is always amazing for me to meet some of our students or learners and then to see them out also and also sometimes work in these places that host these events. When you write a book, you do the thing in the beginning, you know, where you write a little dedication. In the book you dedicate it to someone. I almost had a divorce or that. So if you get the book,
I did.
So if you get the book, have a look at the dedication. Well, maybe I'll tell you, I dedicated the book to my students. And my family thought, I don't know. I then read Steve's and they were like, we still like you, but you know, maybe a little less.
Mine's dedicated to my wife and kids. Happily married.
Which made me look even worse.
Yes.
So I met some students tonight, and so one of them is Amir, I think it was, amazing student, background in industrial design, has worked as an industrial designer, currently studying strategic design. Kind of important, right? Strategic design.
It is.
And the question that we often get, or when I do guest lectures at the university, talk about this book, students get really excited about these topics, which is great. But often they come up to me afterwards and go like, where can I do this? I want to work in this area. I want to do this. And I have to often be honest and say, well, I have to always be honest and say, there isn't that much work in this space yet. It will change, but it might be difficult initially to find work in this area, which is, it kind of makes me sad, and I think I do hope it changes, and I hope by writing this book we contribute to that change, by the government hopefully doing the right things and putting regulations in place that will change, because it will put pressure on the companies, the organizations, by consumers, customers, changing their expectations for the ethical conduct of companies. That will change hopefully practice, and that will create more work for emerging designers that can drive this change using the tactics we talk about in the book. I guess my question, such a long question. My question is, what do we suggest to these young change makers that want to go out and change the world, but also want to have a job and get experience?
So my first response is that there are absolutely organisations who are out there who are working in these sorts of ways and thinking about these sorts of problems in these sorts of ways. I know, like, he's hiding a little bit, but Adrian back there, just say hi, Adrian. Is doing and has been for a number of years doing amazing work in this kind of area, right? Like, Adrian's great. Ben was talking about his business and the work that they're doing, same, right? I don't know the rest of you, so I can't call you out, sorry. But the fact is that there are already organisations that are starting to shift the way that they work. And
Think place as well.
And think place, yeah.
And sure.
There you go. So the short answer is send them up. So that's sort of one part of it. The other part of it, though, is that governments are responding. So I don't know whether you saw, whether you pay attention or not, but the European Union has just released their eco-design policy framework, which is quite detailed and puts in place a raft of regulations that cover things like the first and foremost is that there's a digital passport for all things that get sold in the EU. And that digital passport covers things like where did the materials come from and what percentage of them were recycled versus sort of freshly made. What percentage of it is going to end up in waste, where's the energy from it, so what the carbon footprint of that manufactured good is, like all sorts of things along those lines. Because the EU has done it, people who want to sell in the EU will naturally have to start doing it for all of their products. So we'll, by default, get a little bit of a flow-on impact into Australia for goods that those same manufacturers want to sell here. So that will help. And the Department of Environment is working on our own set of criteria. We released some procurement rules recently. The Environment Minister a couple of weeks ago made the point that we will benefit from the EU, but we need our own version of those rules, not just to accept them by default. So they're going to look at what they've done as a model and start to implement an Australian version of the same kind of thing. That's awesome, because the impact that that has on the Australian landscape is that any organisation that wants to make and sell something here will have to start abiding by those rules, and they don't know how to do it. And the people who can help them do it, sitting back here learning it in college at the moment, learning it in class at the moment, and is ready to go out there and practice. So I think there's amazing opportunity. So Australia has a goal to implement a circular economy by 2030. Framework's being worked on. An interim report was released, I think, 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's due to be released more formally by the end of the year. That circular economy will embed things like not just recycling, but reuse, repair. So there will be embedded in that legislation a right to repair in Australia. Now, if you've had a look at the repairability of most, like, just take a look in your house and look at how easy it would be to repair versus toss away and buy new, and you'll find that most of the stuff that permeates our homes falls into the latter category. Not a lot of it these days that we buy new is really built to last. The materials that are used aren't built to last. They don't last in the sun, they fade and crack. You can't replace them, you've got to throw the whole thing away. The whole casing is moulded in one piece, so you can't, all of these things. We don't have the technicians. We're not allowed to get access to the tools. We're not allowed to get access to the diagnostic software. All of that kind of stuff is going to change. Well, there are whole industries that I've just spoken about that don't exist in this country yet. Certainly not at the scale that we're going to need. People who understand how to design things like that and people who understand how to fix things are going to boom over the next 10, 15 years. There's going to be all sorts of opportunities. And that's one that AI won't steal. So that's going to transform things, and it'll come through, as I say, it's starting in the EU. America will almost certainly follow. Australia is already working on it, and that's going to have a massive impact. That's primarily focused on products, but if you work in services, the same is going to come. So if you think about a service, it gets delivered maybe in a space like this. A lot of this furniture, the carpet and the rest of it, it's not designed for reuse. So you look at your typical office fit out, your typical shop fit out in a supermarket or in a shopping mall. All of that stuff, when they rotate through retailers, it all goes to landfill. It's not designed to be modular. It's not designed to be reused. So when you see the retailer close and then a new one opens a few weeks later, the entire shop was just torn out and tossed away. None of it gets reused. And all of it will have to be. So it's a massive, massive shift that we've got coming. I'm super optimistic about it as a result. Like, I really think there's huge opportunities for us, and the flow and impacts, if we can get the thinking right so that we don't, we're all going to change the way that we design stuff, but just design sort of different versions of bad stuff. Like, we need to get our thinking right. That's why the systems thinking and the understanding how those ripples flow through the systems that we're designing for are so critical, so that we can make better decisions. Okay. That was one question. How about you? Yes?
I think I understand what you meant by that. Why does it have to be, why do you have to design something that has to be reused? Because isn't that an overhead? You're adding extra cost in designing something that may or may not. I mean, it's just extra money.
So did everyone hear the question in the back? You guys want to repeat it?
Isn't designing for reuse creating an overhead? And my immediate response to that is floods are an overhead, fires are an overhead, droughts are an overhead, population displacement is an overhead. We currently waste somewhere between $1 and $2.6 trillion of food globally each year. In the textiles, it's $500 billion just in textiles that goes into landfill each year. So if we can change the way we design things and we can pay a little bit more for that product and stop throwing away trillions of dollars worth of stuff, and that's stuff that we grew, that we cut down, that we mined, that we processed, that we polluted the environment to create, and then we don't use it and we throw it in the fucking ground, like that's bananas. So if we change the way that we're going to do things and it costs us all a little bit more, but instead of lasting 6 months, it lasts a lifetime, take my money.
I don't understand. People don't think like that. People buy stuff.
You're
because
going
they
to
wanna buy
have
new
to.
stuff.
You're going to have to start thinking differently
I buy
about
new clothes
stuff.
because I want to buy new clothes.
Let me ask-
Not because I want to use
Let me ask a
my
follow-up. Like, so,
Sure.
so you're saying people are going to have to, but a more pragmatic scenario that you need to deal with is you work on a project, you work on a design,
Sure.
you're working on something, and there's a bunch of considerations that come into play when you're making a decision. It's not just you as the glorious designer making all the decisions. There's a whole bunch of people. In fact, you might not even have the final decision.
Yep.
So a bunch of things get considered. A lot of them are short term. What techniques and tactics are there to bring the long-term measures into the current thinking?
So-
and not just the environmental piece, but
No, I
as a
understand.
generic solution.
So one of the reasons why the government regulation is so useful is that it takes the choice out of the equation, and it means that everyone is playing the same game on the same cost basis.
So the Nazis, we're gonna go, like government's gonna force us to reuse stuff. Like we're gonna be.
So conflating government regulation with Nazis is probably not the way that I would
We're
go.
gonna be more
You-
so poor
you-
that we
you just-
have to
you just
repair our
did.
clothes.
So government regulation is
Like,
there
is
for a
that
really
insane?
good reason. Government regulation is a good thing, not a bad thing.
I think the important thing, though, and what we talk about in the book a lot, is that the regulations need to speak to the organization. So I was attending a few weeks ago an international conference on human factors in computing system, it's called, and there was a workshop on post-growth human-computer interaction, and we had a big discussion about similar topics there. And there's this theory around post-growth and degrowth, and there's a small committed community that buys into that, and people will change their way they live and be more environmental, pay more money because they can pay more money to have more organic clothes or recycled products. But that alone is not going to be enough, because it's very hard to change human behavior, and because it's also an equity issue, and there's also the issue of a just transition. Not everyone can afford to put solar panels on the roof because they don't have the money. And so that's why it's really important that those government regulations are actually targeting organizations, and organizations are forced to change what they do. And we as designers and decision makers can influence that and help drive that change, so that at the end of the day, ideally the customers get the consumers, the users get the same experience. They may not even notice that it's any different, but there's a lot of stuff happening in the background that makes sure that there's a smaller impact on the environment, or the impact on the environment is reduced.
Sorry, what about the impact of education? Because I think that's like a really important, and you didn't
Totally.
think about it, or you didn't mention
Yeah.
it.
So important.
I completely agree with all of you saying, but you didn't mention anything about how to change the mindset of humanity by education. And the future is gonna be like that if we are not doing something now that is predictable, and then how to educate the next generations. Something that I'm trying to do at my home, and it's very frustrated because I have a limit of movement. And even though I want to, for example, buy things without less plastic, I can't. I can't buy berries without plastic. So it's like government and education, and like individuals cannot do anything if the big corporations and big governments, they don't do anything. And also that frustrates me a bit is like here in Australia we go a step behind Europe, and Europe is now doing that because they've been learning for so many years and so many fails, and instead of copying them right now and learn from what they're doing, we just go like slow the motion.
So we've not addressed every single way that you might impact change in the book. We're targeting designers and the way in which we go about our work, and I agree with you.
This is a big conversation.
Yes.
So we've taken a part of it and we've looked at that to try and put in the hands of designers a way to go about their work differently. Yes.
Hi, sorry, I just want to follow up on the same because I was going to ask something on the similar lines. That have you thought of sort of collaborating with universities or schools or high schools within Australia to sort of workshop this concept or introduce this book and, you know, start the younger generation, sort of give them that kind of idea, start thinking young. So I'm thinking long term here, you know, so they can start and sort of start building their life at a young stage where they have to understand these principles.
Yeah.
Like we've already, I can give you an example of something that is happening in India already, that a lot of authors have introduced coding for toddlers, or 2 to 3 or 3 to 5 age group, where they've simplified the concept of coding to problem solving in daily life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and understanding shapes and colors and numbers and everything in that respect. So have you thought of how you're gonna, like she asked, I mean, how you're gonna target this beyond your existing target audience of designers and established professionals?
Yeah. Again, I'm not sure if everyone heard in the back both the questions. So the first question was, to summarize it very briefly, around education. And the second one was around reaching like people at school, for example, children at school, and so extending our reach beyond the design community. And absolutely, I mean, we can't make people use our book in the classroom necessarily, but we obviously hope that it becomes a resource, and that's also that was one of the motivators for us to also spend time on working on this book. So it becomes a resource that people can use in practice, and also people can use at universities in design and business schools to teach the next generation. So in terms of education, yes, big topic, and there's also the education of everyone in terms of environmental practices. But I guess for me in particular as a design academic, it's about educating the next design generation. And so that's what we are doing through our work at the university. And then to answer your question more specifically, it's actually something we're doing at the Transdisciplinary School at UTS. So we have a number of degrees that focus exactly on these topics, and looking at how to use transdisciplinary approaches and ways of thinking to tackle the complex, big challenges of our time. And so there's a strong focus on sustainability, and that's for example, a bachelor program, the Bachelor of Creative Intelligence and Innovation at BCII, that students can do as a second bachelor. So they do a first bachelor in business or design or computer science or IT, and then they choose that as combine it as a second bachelor. And we have also just started actually a program where we are working with high schools to get year 10 students to come to the UTS campus, and then we're teaching them transdisciplinary ways of tackling complex problems. And we actually got them last year which is when we did the first trial, we actually got them to develop a net zero transition plan for their school, for their high school. So really trying to not just equip them with the right skills, but also help them to maybe start even the first step for their school to move along that path. So absolutely important, and absolutely something we're doing. But it's a collective effort. It's not something that we can do on our own. But it's a collective effort that we hope that if we all work together, then there will be a change happening.
Yeah.
We were just talking about designing stuff. What is your opinion about like designing social structures that like shape how we interact with stuff? What is your opinion about the responsibilities of designers about designing social structures, and more importantly, how do they go about it?
That's a good question.
So absolutely we should be thinking about those things. Absolutely. If I'm understanding your question correctly, can we shift the way people buy things, consume things, share things, the idea of ownership versus communal access, like all of those things are things that I think are up for grabs. If we think about our current you know, sort of ways of living, ways of being, those are all designed. Like they're all socialised, they're all social constructs and cultural constructs. All of those things can be questioned. One of my sort of favourite commentators on modern life is a British guy by the name of George Monbiot. If you're familiar with him, Monbiot, and he talks about this idea of prosperity and a sense of thriving should be something that we see in the public domain. So evidence of a thriving society should be something that you see in public, like a sense of public luxury. Our parks and our hospitals and our schools and our roads and our bridges and our public architecture and our shared spaces, those should be the things that are grand. Those should be the things that are luxurious, the things that we all get to share in together. So our national parks and our open parks and our beaches and our rivers, those should be pristine. Like that should be the way that, and then in private, well, we've got enough to get by. So he's got this sort of idea of public luxury and private sufficiency, and argues that we've actually spent a long time going in the opposite direction. Our sense of prosperity is what we find when we walk in the door of our home, and not what we see in the public domain. And yet from a social point of view and from a communal point of view, the evidence of prosperity should be everywhere. And it should be out there rather than inside. So I think there's real work that we can do there in shifting our thinking, but absolutely there's a role for design in that effort. Any other questions? You at the back, not Drew, yes, you.
Yes. I'm Jane. I was just wondering, because you read out the example about technology and social media.
Yes.
And I feel like a lot of these social structures and kind of values changes obviously comes out of like valuing human connection and valuing the environment and valuing the space, and so much of kind of how we communicate though is kind of through technology. And I feel like kind of, I guess, do worry about kind of co-opting that, because I feel like all the time that we spend on our screens, even if it's to share a good message or to kind of promote the good fight or whatever, but it's more time that we're spending disconnected from those other things that actually build the values that we're trying to reinstate.
Yeah. I was reading a section of a book yesterday, and the book is called The Greatest Estate on Earth. And it's written about Australia and the role that Indigenous Australians had on shaping the landscape. So the way they use fire to sort of shape the land. That's not what I want to talk about, but there's a section around the connection to country and what it means to have a home. And the meaning of that word, the meaning of land to an Indigenous culture is very, very different to what that word means to us, like to most of us in this room at least. For us, it's a very, very shallow word. It's a very superficial word. It's an indication of location rather than the sort of deep spiritual meaning that it carries for an Indigenous person. And the reason I mention it in response to your question is that the more time we spend on devices and the more time we spend not connecting with nature, the less likely it is that we'll make good decisions about the environment. So I think there's absolutely something in there around that dynamic that we need to change and really think hard about. Do we use social media to tell stories about the natural world so that we are more protective of it? Sure, we should use every tool at our disposal to do it. Is there irony in that? Absolutely.
I've got a great idea for solving that problem. It's called the next button on the bottom of the page.
Could do, yeah.
But it's also a great example of the role of policy and government regulation and how it's not necessarily like, it's an important thing and not necessarily a bad thing in many ways, because especially anyone here is kids at home trying to control their social media usage. It's very, very hard, and it's also very difficult because we as parents, we don't know what to do and how to deal with that, and there's also peer pressure, like if you're holding them back when they go to high school, everyone else has a phone, etc. So it's very difficult. And also, of course, the companies behind the phones and the devices and the apps, of course, they're just trying to make as much money as possible because they're acting in interest of the shareholders and trying to grow their business. That's the problem with growth, and hence the idea of post-growth or degrowth. And so those regulations are also set by someone. Often we think about regulations, but there's also people working on those regulations, working in government, people at universities or even in companies, informing what's happening at government, policy reports, etc. And so in some way, I hope is also that the things we talk about in the book maybe also gets in the hands of those people that set regulations, or the students that maybe listen to my guest lecture today start working in a government maybe in a few years' time, and then also come with these ideas into the role and help shape the policies and have a better understanding, or have the right tools at their disposal to map out the complex system and then help shape the policies in the right way, so there's a positive change happening in the world through the pressure that the policies put on the organizations. And there's a line in the book somewhere, if I remember correctly, it goes something like, organizations will never change on their own. Why would they? Especially if they're just again acting in the interest of shareholders. Any change is driven by individuals. And so that's why I think that's really important, the message of the book, that we are responsible for driving the change. We have the ability to enable that change.
There was another question on the side here. Yes.
Yeah. My question was the entire communication that is around us. It's completely hysteria-driven, right? I mean, we're all kind of scared of the future as an individual. So every communication that we come across depend on real estate is the future. Now, how do you invest in that? Buy an insurance to secure your future. How do you retire with so much money? So everything that we see, the communication around is so individualistic and then focused on that one particular individual and then his insecurity about the future. I mean, having a good product is one thing, but how do you drive the entire society towards that good product? Because unless he doesn't see a value for himself, it becomes difficult to kind of communicate any of such good products which are good for future maybe. Because people are not worried about their children, that's what I see. They're worried more about how they retire.
And it's actually, that's a section I read out at the last session we had. People might be familiar with the tragedy of the commons. And so there's a principle, it was coined by Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a science fiction or science fiction climate author. And so he talks about the tragedy of the time horizon, which is essentially that problem that we don't have the ability to project sort of this, our behavior now onto the suffering of future generations. And partly that's because in the past, it's always worked out that the next generation is better off and has better technology, better access to knowledge and education to be able to solve the problems and the mess in a way that the previous generation has created. But that's suddenly no longer working because the challenges are so complex and because of the risk of the tipping points we're approaching. So that's one part of the question. The other part?
I would answer it in a slightly different way, which is that the state of our modern communications and media industry is a result of 40, 50, 60 years of gradual changes, shifts in their commercial models, changes in regulation, changes in content rules, changes in the role of news, changes in the rules that govern journalism and journalistic content and a whole raft of things. I don't think you need to change the entire media landscape in one fell swoop to have an impact. And I'll let you in on a secret, you're not going to. But this is why we focus on, well, what are the small changes that can start eating away at that landscape, that can create positive pockets in a media landscape that people can go to and utilise. Like, that's the bit that we need to focus on. Like, that's the bit that we need to start thinking about, and we need to get really, really good at it. So when we talk about understanding systems and understanding systems dynamic, the thing that I want you to go and look for is the points of maximum impact that you can have with a small amount of effort. So what's the biggest impact you can have with the smallest effort that you as an individual can make? Understand where that is and go at it. That's where we start. Like, that's the bit that we start to do. And gradually over time we'll have an outsized impact because we keep hitting those points of leverage. We find the tipping points and we work at them. But you're not going to change the whole thing in one go. It just doesn't work like that. Yeah.
I just think one of the initial slides that you had business viability written on it.
Yeah.
And you're talking about individuals having an impact, but actually I think one of the things that I worry about, there's not enough models out there to say that there are businesses that can grow for profit for good. And that's sort of that middle area that you're talking about, seeing everybody thriving as the kind of world that people should see as a profitable social good kind of way of adding value to the world. Like, how do we help people to build businesses, not just be individuals trying to make change?
That part about value creation is something that a lot of businesses have lost sight of over the years.
Yeah.
A lot of the business models that you see in operation today are about wealth extraction and value extraction. They're not really about value creation. And we really need to get back to that idea of, if you're getting paid for something and you're making a profit from something, it's not because you're controlling access, but you're literally adding value somewhere along the line. And we don't have enough of those businesses. You're absolutely right.
Totally.
Ben at the back.
You've mentioned semi-directly, and at least implied a lot, who your ideal reader was when you're, as a team, writing the book. I'd love to hear specifically the ideal reader you had in mind and what you hope they do or think differently, or think and then do, hopefully, as a result of reading the book.
I'll let you answer first. So, well, we have very different audiences, and I literally just shut up, so I won't put my opportunity to speak. But look, from my point of view, my audience is in practice, and Martin's is going to be a student. So go.
That's it.
No. What do you want them to do though?
No, it's a good question, a good point, and I think it's easier to write for the audience you know, right? And I guess as an academic, I work a lot with students, with learners. I've taught many thousands of students probably over my time, and so for me that was an audience I had in mind, hence my dedication. And I was, but I think with our previous book, Design, Think, Make, Break, Repeat, we're a bit lucky because we also wrote it for students, but it had a practical application in a business context. And so I was really hoping that this book would kind of also recreate that, and that's also why the collaboration with Steve was really important for me, because Steve can bring that audience into the narrative and into the story and into the things we try to achieve with the book. Definitely for me, just I guess in a way it's also the peers, right? So for me, thinking about colleagues of mine, maybe more colleagues at an earlier stage of the career, working in a university teaching business or design and looking for resources they can use to teach. So also having that in mind. And what we didn't say is the website also has free templates and resources available, and all of the graphics from the book were also available under Creative Commons license. And I remember when I was a young academic and started teaching user experience design and web form design, and I think at the time the Rosenfeld media books were big, and they did something similar. And I remember putting slides together and using that as a resource. And so I think that's something I had in my mind for sure. Yeah, it's definitely not. I don't know how are there any academics in the room? A few, yeah. So I don't know how my academic colleagues will perceive my book or receive my book. It's not a typical academic book in that it's not hardcore theory, which also makes it easy to read, I think.
Yes.
But it's not a totally academic book.
Rather than answer your question, I think it's time to give away some copies of the book. So, before you all arrived, I put silver stickers onto the back of some seats and onto the further back we go where they don't really have a back, there you might be sitting on a silver sticker. So if that's you, you win a copy of the book.
Make sure you grab the sticker and keep the sticker.
Bring the sticker. Bring the sticker with you. Bring the sticker with you up front and we'll get you a copy of the book. Thank you all very much.
If I've accidentally stolen you've allocated a sticker, just to let
Do you have any copies you can actually sell here? No, yeah. That was great. That was great. Thanks, guys. I wanted to start up this policy, but it's great to see book launches coming out. One of the things I like to find is really the board is there's always something to something.
We're working on launching for the Australians.
All right.
Exactly that reason.
This is the problem there, because what I'm finding is
People bring they turn this sticker off.
Yeah.
if you're one of the lucky ones, you get AI now, it's drawing on everything massive size.